From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Glad to have you with us here on Can TV for another week. And as seems to be the case every week, it's been a pretty big week in the news here in Chicago. A 4% rescission of a promised pay increase for the Chicago teachers. A new police chief who says, we're going to obliterate that gang. Every one of their locations has to get blown up until they cease to exist. So we got a lot to discuss today with Mick Dumke from The Reader, who's with us again, and glad to have you back again, Mick.
Thanks, Ken.
And also for a first time, Deputy Editorial Page Editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, Kate Grossman, joining us today. Kate, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kate, why don't we start with you, because the Sun-Times and the Tribune also, both papers today are out with editorials essentially saying, and I assume you had a large part in writing that editorial, saying that the newly constituted Chicago School Board did the right thing in taking that 4% away from the teachers.
I think they did. You know, we approached it with a little caution because, you know, Rahm Emanuel, who'd been the head of CP at Chicago Public Schools last year, also tried to get the teachers union, and there's 7 other unions, but the teachers, of course, is the biggest one, to forego their raise last year. And we got behind it. And then, you know, I felt actually a little snookered, you know, because I don't think they weren't faking like there was a significant budget deficit, but they did end up filling it.
They found it somewhere.
Right, and, you know, and they didn't increase class size to 35, which is what they, you know, the sky was falling. And I don't think they were faking, but I felt like they're putting up the heat, and we bought into it a little bit. So we approached this one, just to be honest, a little more cautiously. But, you know, when we look through the Chicago Public Schools budget numbers, the sky really is falling. I mean, all the sort of big fixes that you've had in the last couple of years, you know, $360 million from the federal government and stimulus money and
that's what I was going to
job
say.
money.
That's when you said last year, part of what messed last year was the president came in with a big check.
Exactly, and that's just not going to happen. We're getting estimated $77 million less from the state, and in previous years it's gone up or at least been flat. You know, and then you have teacher raises, which are going to add $100 million, you know, to their costs, and so there are no big fixes anymore, and you have a $712 million deficit.
Now, there's something you need to clear up for me. There's the number that's running around now, of course, is the $712 million, the $712 million hole in the CPS budget. Does that include the projected 100 and whatever it is million for the 4%?
It does.
So if the 4% is taken off the table, then that $700 million does come down to 605 something. Okay.
Which obviously suggests that they still got a tremendous amount of work to do. But yes, they sent out, which was obviously a big signal, they sent out budgets to all the schools so they could, you know, how many teachers you need to hire for next year. And they closed the books on those actually on Friday, and that did not include the teacher raise, so it was pretty clear they were not going to support it.
I have to tell you that on this show, as much as covering the news, we like to spend time kind of looking at the behind-the-scenes operations and how things are done as often by the press office as by any place else. And I got to tell you, I thought that regardless of what side you're on this, just from a tactical point of view, I thought it was just brilliantly handled. You get these budgets going out to all the schools, and they say, here's what we're projecting for you for next year. And of course, and the principal opens it up, and it's like, no increase in class sizes. That program that I thought was going to go away isn't going away. This isn't as bad as I thought. This is really, this is not bad. I can live with this. And the parents get on board. And then, of course, you get to the bottom line, and it's like, oh, there's this one little thing that's missing, is this 4% raise for all your teachers. But by now, even in this 24-hour, in this news cycle, the one news cycle, you've got everybody buying into this. This isn't as bad as we thought it was. And then the CTU comes out in the next news cycle and says, wait a minute, that money is owed to us, and then what happens? So from a purely tactical point of view, it seemed to me that they did a real end run around the CTU.
Yeah, well, they've played it pretty masterfully, and you know, it's no coincidence. On Monday, Governor Quinn signed this new state education law, which severely restricts the teachers' right to right to strike. And on Wednesday, you set up a scenario where a strike is a potential possibility, but you know, the odds are now decreased because it used to be you had to get 50% of just anyone who was voting, teachers who were voting, to authorize a strike, and now it's 75% of the entire membership. That's an extremely high bar to reach. So, you know, they set this up. I mean, Rahm Emanuel is pretty masterful, I have to say. Whether you agree with him or not, or think he's ruthless or whatever, I mean, he knows how to work it.
It's fascinating, and Mick, I know you can jump in on this too. It's fascinating how many of these conversations are going on over lunch tables all over the city of people saying, I don't know about this Rahm guy. I don't know if I trust him, but man, he sure is. He sure is a great tactician.
His tactical skills, I think, people came in knowing that he was a serious, you know, political player, and we're definitely seeing that. I agree with everything that Kate just said. This was set up in a way, and let's face it, the climate around the country is not in favor of unions right now. So you know, a guy like Rahm Emanuel certainly knows that. You do have a budget deficit, so there are serious fiscal problems to address. But you know, this is a position where the CTU is going to have a very hard time winning, whatever that means. It's
whatever winning, however.
Exactly, they're going to have a hard time coming out on top.
Although
of
let's
this
not
one.
assume that this is. I mean, what they did yesterday at the Board of Education, they voted. They said they didn't have a reasonable expectation to fund the raises, but that doesn't mean. It's not the end of the story.
Right. Oh,
you know,
it absolutely isn't.
There's going to be negotiations.
But it's also fascinating to put it in context with, you know, as you say, Mick, there's sort of this larger national thing of what's going on in Wisconsin and Ohio, and we can all list all the places, where you kind of get this impression that, well, you know, the Illinois law that was the package of legislation is more pro-teacher than what is going on in the rest of the country, so maybe this is a sort of a give and take kind of an environment. It works very well for the new Board of Education and for Rahm Emanuel to be able to kind of get the cover of what's going on to the north in Wisconsin and say, well, at least we're not doing what they're doing up there.
Yeah, he's come out and said that.
We're
I'm
good
not
guys.
Scott Walker. We're not doing it the same way. But you know, politically, he also has that weapon, basically saying, you know, when you say I'm not Scott Walker, you basically are also saying I could be Scott Walker.
Right.
You know, and so
I have the
we prefer to do it another way, but we're
right.
still going to get what we want. Essentially,
it's a real kind of a tough guy act in a very, you know, in a suit, but kind of like, yeah, you know, I do have in the cabinet over here, I do have this big weapon, and you're not going to make me get it out now, are you?
But I also think it is, in fairness, it is the way people would prefer to see, you know, their mayor here, one of their leaders work. I think most people, whether you're for or against, you know, whatever side you're on this particular issue, I think most people are looking to the north and saying, we don't want that here, for sure. And so I think, you know, again, Rahm Emanuel also can sort of present himself as, I'm a more thoughtful version of this kind of hard policy.
To what degree do either of you, where do you place in this whole fabric that we're talking about Jean-Claude Brassard? Is he a part of this negotiation? Is he kind of one of the strategists in this, or did he come in too late for this?
You know, it's sort of hard to tell, but I mean, one of the amazing things, and Emmanuel did this with all the teams in all the different agencies around the city. I mean, he didn't just pick a school superintendent, or CEO as we call it. I mean, he picked the whole team. Usually, you're the school superintendent. You get to pick your chief education officer, your press person. I mean, Emmanuel picked them all for, I mean, said, you know, in consultation with Brassard. But I mean, you know, he's from New York, like he doesn't, you know, I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't cut, he was cut out or anything, but, so, and I'm not, you know, I'm not suggesting that Brassard is a puppet head, a figurehead. He's not at all. I mean, you know, he's an accomplished guy. I think, you know, we'll see what happens, but there is this sense that City Hall is orchestrating things.
Yeah. Well, sure, I mean, it's a school board that Rahm handpicked. I mean, he handpicked the superintendent. I mean, it's obvious that he got people who are going to work with him on the terms he wants to work with. So, you know, he did sort of clear the decks and bring in his own people, which, you know, was he won the election. He has the right to do that.
Well, I just want to wander down this little Jean-Claude Brizard cul-de-sac for just a moment, because before you were, elevated into the tower of being the oracle for the Sun-Times.
Is that a tower?
I wish it felt like a tower.
The Sun-Times Tower. You spent some time, a good deal of time, covering education in Chicago. So, what do you make of the circus that happened as Brizard was brought in? Really made him look bad, and I think there was a period of time when it really looked like, boy, we really chose the wrong guy. This is a clunker. But that seems to be changing, I think. And I'm just wondering, did he get a raw deal coming in the door? Was he?
Well, a couple things happened. I mean, the main brouhaha was over information that was given out by Emmanuels' office that I guess came from Brizard about graduation rates. He'd been the superintendent in Rochester, and they were clearly inflated. There was no question about it.
Right.
There's a lot of interesting things about that. Number one, and this is just the micromanaging of Rahm Emanuel, Brizard wasn't allowed to talk. They had this press conference, and he's, hello, I'm here from Rochester. Basically, that's all he said.
Yeah.
And that was a big mistake, because not that Brizard could have explained away the inflating the graduation rates, but at least he could have presented himself. And the guy knows what he's talking about. He was a principal, regional superintendent in New York City. He's not a hack. He's an accomplished guy.
But he looked like that puppet you were talking
looked like
about.
a puppet.
The way they presented him.
Right,
Absolutely.
and this is a pattern that we're seeing with Emmanuel. Emmanuel does not get his facts right a lot. We're seeing this. And people argue, well, the facts aren't as important. It's the big picture. I'm with him on the direction, and of course that is important too. But as a reporter, the facts really matter, and we've seen time and time again with education that Emmanuel completely misstates things. He says 7 out of the 10 top high schools are all charter schools. Well, that's just wrong. And he just repeats it even when he's been corrected. So
it's that Washington thing. Once you've drunk from the golden chalice.
Well, it is actually. They run their political operation very Washington style. You stick to the talking points, and you're right. The details. Oh, that's not so important. You just stick to the themes, even if it's a detail like it's 3 out of 10 instead of 7 out of 10.
Even if there's a couple of you nipping at their heels, they can handle that.
Yeah, even if it's not actually true, you sort of stick to the theme.
I'm really interested to see. I mean, Emmanuel obviously is a creature of Washington, and the longer he is mayor of Chicago, I mean, everyone's kind of trying to, give him a little time. But I mean, it's not going to last very long, right? I mean, we've been criticizing him for these factual errors, and this rose garden kind of approach is just not going to last in a gritty city where you have, tons of reporters and people who are way better informed than he is on these issues.
Yeah, it's not going to last if you don't show any interest in the details, if you actually are making the grand pronouncements without following through on some of the little stuff, and we can actually see the impact of this stuff. There's a sense that so much of this is orchestrated, and I don't think he can be criticized just for orchestrating it. The criticism will continue to come. I think you're right, Kate, if the orchestration isn't accompanied with substance.
Right. But then again, on the bread and circuses side of things, we were talking about this a little bit on the show last week, and I don't want to make more of this than it deserves, but I think it's an interesting observation, is that Rahm Emanuel is so much more in the moment in his city than our previous mayor, who was royal and had about as much connection as Queen Elizabeth has to London. I mean, it's just kind of like, this guy, he's all over the place on Sundays, which is just the weirdest thing. I mean, the idea of seeing your mayor on Sunday is something that that was just never done.
Yeah, but he needs to do that.
Oh, he does. He does. Yeah.
And I mean, in the sense, and I'm not excusing Daley for not being out on Sundays, but Daley was a creature of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel, like I said, Rahm Emanuel doesn't know Chicago that well. I'm not going to get into the residency issue, but I mean, the fact is he spent most of his professional life outside of Chicago, so he needs to be out at all these things.
No, I think that's right. And trust me, I'm making only a very trivial point here, and I don't mean anything deep by it, but it's just kind of jarring sometimes to see that, you know, he was at the Riviera, concert at the Riviera. Like, what? The
Absolutely.
mayor? How do they handle detail on that? How do they handle the security detail on that? But anyway, but we digress. So let's...
we're glad he knows where the Riviera is, and
well,
I think
you know,
Kate's point is well made. That is,
yeah.
you know, he clearly seems to enjoy all this stuff,
Right,
going to
right.
Bulls games, whatever.
Right.
But you know, it's not just that. He makes sure people know that
See
he was
that
there.
he's there.
Absolutely.
He makes sure the press office
You know, he's a
drops
fan of Wilco. Jennifer Hudson did a fundraiser for him.
Right,
you know,
right,
these
right.
things may all be authentic, but there also is a larger political game
But
to be made.
I bet it plays well with the younger crowd, though. I mean, you know, it's like we got a mayor who's a little hipper than the old guy. Anyway, too much time on that. Let's talk about the other big department. Let's talk about police. We have a lot of things going on there. Mick, you've written several pieces. You have a piece out today in the Reader about gun laws and that kind of thing. But I'd like you to just expound a little bit on something you wrote yesterday about when McCarthy was at his confirmation hearing. He said some things that could only be interpreted as being more than a little critical of our former mayor and his abolitionist attitude about guns. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was striking that he came out, and this was sort of an unsolicited remark. It wasn't, what's your position on gun control? It was, he was asked to comment on a portion of the city's gun law, which actually isn't being carried out by the police department. They were required under the law that was put in place last year to create a gun offender registry, sort of like a sex offender registry, that's supposed to enable police and I guess by extension the public to track if you've got a guy who's convicted of trafficking guns living down the block from you. You should be able to know that. Great idea.
I think that would be at least as important as knowing that somebody had a sex offense 15 years ago.
I would think well, it's not more or less important, but I would say, yeah, it definitely seems like it's potentially a great tool for keeping track of what's going on, but it hasn't been done. And so Ed Burke asked him a question about that. McCarthy noted that they had a similar thing in New York City. He was a big believer in it. He said he would try to get it up and running in Chicago. Actually, getting back to your point, he didn't just say he would try to. He said, we're going to do it here.
We're going to do it.
I believe in it. It's going to happen. But then he went on and sort of, you know, just went ahead and added his own thoughts on the matter of gun control more broadly and said, you know, I think that there's a place in this country, 95% of the people are somewhere in the middle. There's the NRA on one side and there's gun abolitionists on the other side, and I think we ought to be moving to the center, and I'm intent on helping us do that, making Chicago a platform for moving this debate to the center. And that was striking because anyone who's been around here and ever heard Mayor Daley talking about crime, gun control knows he was one of those abolitionists.
He was an abolitionist, there's no doubt
you
about
know,
that.
and so I thought it was notable. And I don't know if this was a particularly scripted moment for McCarthy. I suspect that isn't something that Rahm Emanuel himself would say, but it was notable that the police chief is sort of like, I want to be on the center of this issue. Because Mayor Daley not only, I think, believed in this passionately himself, that all guns were bad, but he also used it politically. Whenever there would be a question about the latest flare-up in violence or whatever, he would often shift the conversation to gun control, go off on a rant, you know, I hope the Supreme Court, you know, has an encounter so that they understand how important gun control is, that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a very interesting
Where
moment.
do you live? Pointing at all the reporters.
Exactly.
I bet you don't have gangbangers on your corner, do you? Well, I don't have them outside my house either, but people do it. Yeah, oh yeah, we've all heard that. And of course, you had your own experience with the mayor on gun control, which, for those who don't remember, the mayor offered to assault this guy when he
wanted to make me a believer in gun control as well, I guess.
Probably
waving one at me.
Probably the low point in the entire 22 years of the Daley administration came as a result of your asking him a question.
I do think it was a symbol to a lot of people that he was tired, he was on edge, and that he'd sort of like, you know, lost a certain sense of being able to actually talk or debate about any kind of an issue. If he ever had it, he certainly
didn't have it on that day anyway.
Exactly.
But it did, of course, raise this larger question that you know you're continuing to write about now. 120,000 people, if I have this right, in Chicago have state FOIA cards, have registered with the state of Illinois that they have weapons. in their house.
Right,
but
a Ford
2%
car, yeah.
of them have registered with the city.
Correct. It's about 116,000 in the state. So in order to own a gun, to possess a gun, even to buy ammunition, you're supposed to have a state firearm owner's identification card. The city law requires everyone who has a handgun, and then after a certain point in time, grandfather clause will end, and even people with long rifles are supposed to register those weapons as well. There's only 3,100 people who've done that so far in Chicago. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to Chicago's law, so it's not a straight apples to apples comparison. But like you said, it's like 3% of the people who've registered with the state to own guns have done it with the city. So somewhere in that 97%, there's a lot of people who aren't complying with the city law.
I mean, you know, if they're on some other, arresting someone on some other charge, are they finding people who have guns who, you know, are they coming down on people who have guns who haven't registered?
That's a good question. I did a story about that earlier, and no, the city's gun law isn't enforced very often either, for the simple reason that state and federal gun laws have far more severe penalties. Those are felonies.
Right, so
the city's gun law is a misdemeanor. So, to be honest, it appears that it's mostly in place for political reasons. Police tell me.
Are you saying there's politics?
Can you believe
in
it?
Chicago?
Even in gun control
even
laws.
in gun control, yeah.
And I'm not a gun guy, but I think it's important to have a serious debate about it. With, you know, let's strip away sort of the sheen of saying we're being tough on this because, you know, it's not being enforced. People aren't complying with it. Why is it there?
You know, this is, again, another minor cul-de-sac here, but I got a lot of them today. I was rereading some of the stuff you had written on gun control in the last couple of days, and went back to some of the earlier pieces you'd written. I was fascinated to see that there are like 600 comments to one of your stories. And I maybe made it through the first 100 or so, and only to find that they're virtually 100% people who favor lessening gun control laws in Chicago. And that is a bit surprising given what I perceive to be the readership of the Reader, but you know, it's a very emotional issue in this town.
Well, yeah, first of all, people who are in favor of looser gun control laws, you know, gun rights, conceal and carry, the whole line, are very, very active. So I think there's a disproportionate representation in the comment section of any of our newspapers. But I do think that's true. I mean, the reason I continue to do this is I'm interested, but I was down in Jackson Park a few weeks ago just talking to guys about fishing, guys who were sitting there watching their bobbers trying to catch some crappie. And unprovoked, people start asking me, well, what do you think about guns? Because I'm sick and tired of being jumped out there and whatever. Then at a community meeting in Chatham where these nice, you know, senior citizen, elderly people were having a debate about guns. It's out there. And especially, this is another thing I know you wanted to talk about, the issue of police deployment, declining ranks of the police officers. There's a lot of people who think, you know, we should at least have a debate about our gun laws because it's tied into, you know, the ability of people to protect themselves.
Right. Well, you guys had a pretty stark event this week with one of your reporters actually witnessing. Well, tell that story. It's an amazing story.
Kim Jansen was out covering, there was a shooting he was there covering a funeral, or a memorial service for a kid who had died. And he's standing on the corner and sees a guy up the street shoot somebody else. And at first he said he thought, well, he heard a crack, you know, and it doesn't, you know, not that I've heard gunfire so often, but you don't really think it's real, especially, and Kim said, because there were 30 people standing there, but it, you know, it was, you know. So, you know, he wrote a first-person story about it because it's, his lead was something like, usually I arrive after the shootings.
Yeah, right, but not
this time. Yeah.
And then, of course, to add a coda to that, yesterday there was another shooting on the block. This time the police, I believe, killed someone, right?
That
died that they shot. There's a dispute about whether he was a gang member, whether he had a gun or anything else, but three shootings.
There always is after those.
Well, of course, right. But three shootings on the very same block. Now, of course, it's interesting that if any one of those events had happened anywhere else, we wouldn't even be talking about it. The fact that it happened all on one block focuses our attention, but we have so much to focus on because of all of this attention that we're now paying to these. What did McCarthy call them on Channel 11? They're not flash mobs. They are multiple offender incidents, MOIs. And we're having a lot of MOIs in
Yeah.
the city right now, and that also is focusing our attention. What's been your position on this editorially about the big dispute that's happened about whether to identify the offenders by race?
We haven't actually taken a position. You know, I don't know. I mean, it's among, you know, the first round of arrests. I mean, apparently most of the kids were African American. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I don't have any problem with identifying, you know, someone as
But
in
you
a factual
wouldn't
basis.
normally identify in a. I mean, it's
Right,
such
it's not
such a tough
relevant. I
issue.
mean, the
Yeah.
the sort of standard I carry is, you know, you identify someone's race if it's relevant to the story, you know, and you know, if 5 kids are arrested for jumping someone, it's not relevant, right? The race of the, you know, the defendant,
Yeah, yeah.
anyone, unless there's, you know, they yell racial epithets, whatever. So that's not relevant. But it's come up because, you know, these attacks are happening on the Gold Coast and Michigan Avenue or whatever, and that's mostly white. And then you
victims have been white.
and the victims
Yeah.
have been white.
Well, it's been also interesting to watch. I'm not so sure it's been happening as much with you, but on a couple of occasions, the Tribune has had to shut their comment boards down
Really?
because of the viciousness of the comments that have been coming in on that.
That's why I don't read those things.
Yeah, well, it's always good
Right.
advice not to read them.
It's a tough thing, though, because people are talking about it, and they're talking about the racial aspect. So
Right.
I think it's, you know, it's something we should continue to debate and wrestle with, I think, as journalists.
It's
but
definitely a media.
yeah, and it's not necessarily something we should be introducing to the story, but it's out there, so I don't think you can turn away from
Yeah,
it
but
either.
I mean, the bottom line is it really doesn't matter whether they're black or white or Latino. The fact of the matter is they're, you know, hoodlums, you know, coming up
There
and
are
attacking.
MOIs happening.
Right, and the
right.
issue is more about class and the kids have enough to do and where are their parents.
right.
And I mean, really, I honestly don't. The race is a marker, but it's not the point.
Yeah, but I think if it were a different group of kids, I wonder if the reaction would be the same, honestly. I mean, you know, that's speculation on my
Right,
part. I
right.
think one of the mothers of one of the, you know, alleged offenders basically said as much, too. She said, look, if this happened in my neighborhood, in our neighborhood on the south side,
Yeah.
wouldn't get as much attention. The fact that it is downtown, there's class, there's race, I think all that stuff makes it.
Well, and the
makes it
race is relevant too because if you see a group of now 5 black kids downtown, they're getting
That's gonna be a big
profile.
issue.
I mean, to me, that's a tough issue.
And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, we got to cut it off there. As we always say about this point, 29 minutes goes by so quickly we don't even know. We're just getting started. But I want to thank Mick Dumke for coming back to the show again. Hope you'll be back many more times.
Thanks for having me on.
Mick Dumke from the Chicago Reader. And today, Kate Grossman joining us from Sun-Times Tower, where she is a deputy editor.
we have no tower.
Because, I just want to say to Tom McNamee, who was supposed to be on the show today, who had a family situation come up, hope everything's okay with you, and thanks for agreeing to be on the show. We'll see you next time. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom on It's a Community Service of CAN TV. And of course, you can find us here on cable, but you can see this and other programs online at cantv.blip.tv. You can check us out there. You can subscribe on iTunes. I'm not tweeting anything this week because I'm afraid I'll get in trouble. But we'll see you next week right here on TV, okay? Thanks for joining us. I'm Ken Davis. We'll see you next time.